The last country in Europe to make widespread use of the steam locomotive into the 1990s, Poland has been forced by economic and political problems to place railway modernization fairly low on its list of priorities. As in the Third World, low wages and cheap coal have combined to extend the life of the steam locomotive, now virtually extinct in neighbouring East European states. Over 500 of them are still around, with about 150 actually in service every day. There are no steam expresses left now, but steam-hauled local passenger and freight trains can still be found in several parts of the country. Also, there is some steam left on the narrow gauge, and later in this programme we shall take a look at one line that's still 100% steam operated. To fully appreciate the character of Poland's railways, it's useful to consider the country's recent history. When Europe's railway network took shape in the 19th century, Poland had ceased to exist as a separate nation. Germany, Russia and Austria had divided the country between them, forming the so-called partitions of Poland. At the end of the First World War, the picture changed dramatically. Austria and Germany had been defeated, while Russia was in the throes of revolution. This left the way clear for Poland to re-establish herself as an independent state. Although Germany still retained East Prussia, a large enclave on the Baltic coast. The Polish State Railways, the PKP, were formed, and set about the task of unifying the disparate fragments of their former occupiers' rail networks. This included construction of a new line to the port of Gdynia on the Baltic, as Poland was denied sovereignty over neighbouring Danzig. The job was hardly done when the Germans occupied Poland again, in 1939, precipitating the start of the Second World War, when the western half of Poland's railways became part of the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Later in the war, when Russia eventually drove the invading Nazis back across Poland, considerable use was made of armoured trains to harass the Germans and provide covering fire while teams of saboteurs prevented the retreating Germans from making effective use of the railway. When the war ended and the Nazis were defeated and driven out for good, Poland suffered a geographical revolution by being pushed bodily westwards. She lost her eastern provinces to Russia, receiving in exchange large slices of defeated Germany in the west and the north. The population was shifted too, as Poles and Germans alike moved west in vast numbers, mostly on foot or on horseback. Many of them had to cling for dear life to the handrails of the few trains that managed to run in the chaotic aftermath of war. Despite these sweeping changes, much of present-day Poland still possesses a distinctly German atmosphere. In former East Prussia, for example, just a few miles from the Soviet border, the towns and villages could as well be in Saxony, 500 miles to the west. The austere Protestant architecture of the Lutheran Church also survives, though now used by Polish Catholics, while in Silesia in the south, German inscriptions can still be seen in a country supposedly purged of its German character by the rigid Stalinist regime of post-war Poland. On the railways, many of the stations still betray a German past, as in this splendid example at Gdańsk, formerly known as Danzig. These old German water towers are a familiar landmark in scores of small towns and stations. Much of the railway furniture, too, still bears conspicuous marks of former times. But the most striking survivor of all is the German Kriegslok, the Deutsche Reichsbahn Class 52 steam locomotive. Developed in 1940 as an all-purpose standard wartime machine for haulage of military supply trains. To the Polish railwaymen, a more vivid reminder of the Nazi years would be hard to imagine. But the engines were far too valuable to let sentiment intervene, and the Poles acquired 1,300 of them as war reparations in 1945, classifying them as TY2. Originally designed for about 10 years' service to see Germany through its war effort, these rugged engines have outlived their expected lifespan by nearly 40 years. Their construction was almost entirely welded, with a tremendous saving in production man-hours, while the axle load of these powerful machines was only 15 tons, which made them ideal for the long cross-country Polish lines laid with light rail. After nearly half a century of Polish ownership, this old Kriegslok still bore the faded initials of the Deutsche Reichsbahn on its axle boxes. The engines were not too well maintained by the Poles, who seemed content to let the brake shoes wear dangerously thin. In 1990, there were still 300 of them on the books. Here's one arriving at Wolstein with a local freight, typical duty for Poland's surviving Kriegsloks. "30 kilometers southwest of Poznan, Wolstein is one of the most interesting of Poland's remaining steam centres, and was originally called Wolstein, forming the hub of a network of Prussian provincial railways built in the 1890s. In 1919, the new Polish frontier placed Wolstein in Poland, cutting it off from the western lines. In World War II, the invading Germans took over again, and Wolstein regained its original role as a provincial railway centre. In 1945, the whole area became part of modern post-war Poland, with all the stations acquiring Polish names. The Germans departed in such haste that most of their rolling stock was left behind, including over 2,000 locomotives. Not just the Kriegsloks, but many older types as well. Of particular interest at Wolstein was ex-Prussian P8 class 460, number OK1359. She was the last of her class in service in Poland, being retained as an active museum piece. The P8s were introduced by Germany's Prussian State Railways in 1906 and were such a success that 3,800 of them were built over a 20-year period, making them one of Europe's most numerous classes. After the First World War, they became spread right across Europe, eventually seeing service in 11 countries, from France to Romania, and even parts of Soviet Russia. Poland inherited the P8s as a result of the border changes. The locos acquired white Polish eagles on their cabsides, but otherwise carried on as before, usually remaining at their home depots, such as this one at Wolstein. The There are now plans to bring other historic locomotives to Wolstein, and the shed is intended to become an operating museum after the end of normal steam working in Poland in the mid-1990s. In immaculate condition in 1989 was TY-42, number 148, one of a unique batch of German Kriegsloks actually built in Poland after the Nazi occupation. As soon as the war ended, one of Poland's top priorities was to rebuild her railway workshops and introduce new Polish designs. Among them, these stylish passenger 262s, the OL-49 class, several of which are based at Wolstein. Intended mainly as a replacement for the aging P8s, there were 116 of them, designed and built in Poland in 1949. 40 years later, many of these big 262s were in store, being used in turn so that each locomotive received equal wear. The rusty patches on number 81's driving wheels showed some weeks of disuse, as she was put back into service for her next spell of duty. About 65 members of the class survived in 1989, thinly spread throughout Poland and used mainly on secondary routes and branch lines. But the increasing use of diesels has made many of them redundant, and more withdrawals are inevitable. As number 81 was turned, a brand new diesel passed by, hauling a two-coach local to Silicon, formerly a typical steam duty. But the Wolstein to Novi Sol service was still steam. This was the midday departure viewed from the level crossing by the depot. The best kept of Wolstein's OL-49s at this time was number 105, often being specially requested for railfans' excursions. On this occasion, the locomotive was being prepared to work the branch service from Konotop Junction to Leszno. After leaving the yard, number 105 ran light the 27 kilometres to Konotop. Konotop was a typical German branch line junction from the turn of the century, and 45 years of Polish ownership have brought about little change except for a respelling of the name. But the trains nowadays have a distinctly Polish look about them, now that they're powered by the big 262s instead of the old Prussian P8s. The two-coach local to Leszno seems an absurdly modest task for these handsome and powerful locomotives, originally designed for mainline passenger work. A familiar feature of the Prussian local railways was the signal box attached to the station. These can be seen all over western Poland, usually with the original equipment still in use. The area served by the line is typical of rural Poland, with its almost empty roads where horse-drawn traffic is still the norm, and the branch line steam train is the only visible sign of progress. Branch line closures are quite rare in Poland, the late Dr. Beeching having so far found few disciples in Eastern Europe. This country halt with its derelict buildings and overgrown track may look closed, but is in fact still open. The peace of a summer's afternoon is briefly disturbed by the arrival of number 105, whose immaculate appearance is strangely at odds with the shabby surroundings. A deserted halt with no officials about is, however, the perfect place to ask for a ride in the cab, and the obliging engine crew gave us a close-up view of this beautifully maintained locomotive at work, steaming down an apparently abandoned track bed in its closing years of service. The third common type of Polish steam locomotive still in use is this 282 tank engine, the TKT-48 class. This is a general-purpose machine, of which 194 were built in 1948. Although originally classed as a freight engine, most of the survivors now spend their time on local passenger trains, such as the Przemysłów to Kepnow service. This is another scene typical of Western Poland, where the old German line-side features remain, while a post-war Polish locomotive operates the service. When originally opened, these lines were designated as light railways or Nebenbahn. The poor track and slow pace of the trains have led English visitors to nickname them Trundlebahns. Another relic of the old Prussian railways is this substantially built wayside station, the last before Kepnow, where once again little has changed over the years. Kepno is a junction on the old main line from the Silesian coalfields northwards to the Baltic ports. The branch train from Nemyslov passed a fine array of old-style semaphore signals, while another engine waited to do some shunting. In the last years of steam, the shed here was one of Poland's busiest, with several branches in the area remaining steam-worked, and some mainline freight as well. As the painted sign showed, the OL-49 passenger engines used to be here too. They'd all gone by 1989, but it was still a 100% steam depot with an immaculate stud of TKT-48s that made it the best centre to see Poland's last tank engines in service. Alas, Kepno has not been designated as a scanson or living museum like Volstein, so this rare European scene of a busy steam shed will soon disappear. Several of the engines were kept in special green livery, and on some of them the unique Polish type of smoke deflector was decorated with the colours of the national flag. In many areas of Poland, the steam locomotive has already disappeared. At Klodzko, in the southwest, there were just 2 engines left in 1989, in what had until recently been one of Poland's major steam centres. The diesel takeover started in the mid-80s, and by 1989 was almost complete, with steam making just an occasional appearance in the freight yards. The shed here had just 2 steam duties left, one for an ex-German TY2 freight loco, and another for a TKT-48 tank engine of the same type we saw at Kepno, to work the branch to Złotystok. The loco was attached to a midday freight for the 20 kilometres to the branch junction of Kamieniec, in order to work the afternoon and evening trips. The line was formerly the Reichensteiner Bahn, a private railway owned by a Herr Güttler of Hamburg, and opened on the 3rd of November 1900. It was just 12 kilometres long and served the town of Reichenstein on the Czech border. When Germany lost the area in 1945, the line was taken over by the PKP, the terminus being renamed Złotystok. Pleasantly situated in the foothills of the Sudeten Mountains, this peaceful branch line with its one-coach steam trains was a delightful reminder of the pre-beaching era in Britain. Although his line was private and quite short, Herr Güttler's terminus was the equal of any country station of the state railways, and survives today, unchanged except for its new Polish name. A nearby factory provides freight traffic for the line, and the evening trip was usually a mixed train. As the branch engine ran up the yard to turn, it came to within a few hundred yards of the Czech border. Unfortunately, the trains ran at such inconvenient times that hardly anybody used them, a fact that was finally noticed officially in Warsaw in January 1990, when the passenger service was withdrawn. Although there are now only 3 main types of standard gauge locomotive left in service in Poland, there are some older types on display at the Open-Air Railway Museum in Warsaw, where an interesting collection has been assembled beside the suburban station at Główny. There are some old Austrian types here, and these powerful 10-coupled tank engines used for heavy freight in the Silesian coalfields. The exhibits include one of the elegant PT-31 282s built just before the war, complete with its stylish Art Deco construction plate. The post-war version of this design, the PT-47, has also been withdrawn, but at least 2 are being restored for excursion use, based either at Wolsztyn or Klodzko. A reminder of the wartime years, there's also a military train, the locomotive clad in armoured plating, and still exercising a strong fascination for the younger generation. To get some idea of the atmosphere of Polish steam in its heyday, we're grateful to Steve Morris for this 8mm film of a railway visit to Poland in 1975, when German Kriegsloks could still be found working in pairs on the steeply graded Zakopane branch in the mountains on the Czech border. This 280 was one of a batch of US Army Transportation Corps engines sent to Poland as part of the Marshall Aid Plan in 1945. They were nicknamed the Big Jims. Some suburban trains still used the pre-war 262 tank engine, the OKL-27 class, predecessor of the TKT-48 seen earlier in this program, and originally introduced in 1928. The PT-31 class 282 express passenger locos of the type we saw at Warsaw Museum were still in use on express trains, such as this one leaving Lublin for Chelm on the Soviet border. Along with their post-war version, the PT-47, they also hauled the Carpathian Express, The shed at Lublin had a typical steam-age roundhouse, where the lady turntable operator spent her days delivering these now defunct giants of steam to the station yards. This American-built engine was a 210 of the TY246 type. "100 of them were delivered from 1946 onwards, and they were the most powerful engines ever to run in Poland, although the 20-ton axle load limited their range of operation to main lines only. The Poles were so impressed with them that they built their own copy of this imposing design in 1951. There were small mechanical variations, and Polish-type smoke deflectors and tenders were fitted, but in all essentials these TY51s were virtually identical with their American predecessors. Mainline diesels were already making steam engines redundant, and the scrapyard was the last destination for the larger types, which were too heavy to be redeployed to the branch lines. In addition to the standard gauge lines, there were scores of narrow gauge branches scattered throughout the country. The locomotives were originally of German or Austrian origin, dating from the turn of the century or before. After the last war, these were replaced by a post-war Polish narrow gauge design, the PX48 class, introduced in 1948. Diesels were introduced in the 60s and spread rapidly. Here at Krośnie-Wyce, for example, the passenger service had been dieselized by 1975. By 1989, steam had almost disappeared from the narrow gauge, but there was just one all-steam narrow gauge operation left at Środa, about 30 kilometers east of Poznan. When the line to Santomierzyl was opened in 1910, it was an extension of the Środa Kreisbahn, which ran through to Poznan and was originally of meter gauge. The area was still part of Greater Germany. In 1953, it was converted to the 75 centimetre gauge, and in 1968 the old route to Poznan was closed, leaving just the 14-kilometre Zanimierzyl branch, which is now the last place in Poland to see regular steam passenger trains on the narrow gauge. A daily service of 6 trains each way requires the depot to keep 2 engines in steam every day, with a third on standby. The engine being prepared here was number 1920, one of the State Railway's last narrow-gauge engines, built in the Krzanów works in 1955. On this sunny June day in 1989, number 1920 was booked to work the 905 mixed from Środa to Zanimierzyl. Although now a terminus, Środa town was originally a through station with trains to Poznan. The freight consists of standard gauge wagons on narrow gauge flat cars, quite a common arrangement in Central and Eastern Europe. This hybrid little train is rendered even more bizarre by the different colours of green paint applied to the passenger coaches. Dwarfed by the large wagon right next to it, the tiny locomotive is nevertheless perfectly proportioned, a half-scale mainline engine of surprising elegance for such a utilitarian machine. One reason for steam's survival at Schroeder is the poor state of the track. Diesels are desperately needed to speed up the service, but the line has to be relaid with better rail first. The original terminus at Zanimiesel still stands. The events of 2 world wars have swept past this backwater and left it unchanged, apart from its name, since 1910, when the railway staff and their families posed proudly outside their brand new station with their brand new engine, symbolising the latest in economic progress. Today, however, the survival of the steam train symbolises the exact opposite. Buses are few and far between, and private car ownership is very low, resulting in crowded trains even outside the rush hours. We shall now join the people of Zanimiesel on the 10:15 Shoppers train and abandon all Western values of speed and efficiency as we settle down for a 1-hour journey for the 9 miles to Schroeder. A ride in the cab between 2 of the halts is to experience at close quarters the deficiencies of the track, causing the locomotive to lurch and sway alarmingly, even at low speed. The train stops in the middle of the fields to pick up people who seem to have appeared from absolutely nowhere. This alighting passenger evidently has a long walk ahead. A suburb of Schroeder, Slupia Welska, provides the train with a rush of customers who are poorly rewarded in the way of station facilities. The narrow gauge train then crosses the electrified main line to Poznan, and as it passes the exchange sidings, we experience another of those illusory time warps, catching both a German water tower and a Kriegslok in a single glance. On arrival at Schroeder town station, the neat little Polish engine delivers the patient shoppers of Zanimysl to their destination. In 1990, upgrading of the narrow gauge track was started and was due to be completed in 1991. This will bring the long-awaited diesels, and the Polish narrow gauge steam passenger train will become a thing of the past. Our final destination in Poland is Mazuria in the northeast, a region well liked by the Poles for its rustic charms and known as the land of 1,000 lakes. But the tranquil beauty of the place belies its turbulent past, for this was once part of German East Prussia, which stretched up the Baltic coast as far as Lithuania. The territory was lost in 1945, with the Soviets taking the northern part, while the province of Mazuria was annexed to Poland. The old Prussian main lines were cut, but the network based on elk still flourishes, and many passenger trains were still steam-hauled in 1989. This Kriegslok on a train from the border town of Goldap was seen leaving the junction at Olecko. There's one line in particular that contrasts starkly with the tourist image of Mazuria's lakeland. This is the steam-worked branch from Kenshin to Węgorzewo, formerly Rastenburg and Angerburg. The tourist attraction here is none other than the infamous Wolf's Lair, formerly Hitler's eastern headquarters, a massive concrete bunker complex hidden deep in the forests close to the Soviet frontier. The nerve centre of Hitler's ill-fated bid to conquer Russia, and the place where most of the Nazi atrocities were instigated, this dank and forbidding patch of forest has now been thrown open to visitors, to wander in and out of the ruins of this Nazi citadel and ponder on its evil associations. Even Hitler's generals described it as a mixture of cloister and concentration camp. But the Führer was immensely proud of it. He had a private railway station built for his staff and guests. A rare piece of archive film captures him acknowledging the driver's Sieg Heil from a brand new Kriegslok. It was pulling a special train with a special guest, his Axis partner Benito Mussolini. The date, July the 20th, 1944. "45 years later, the same German Kriegsloks still ply the branch. The Nazis left in too much of a hurry to take all their locomotives with them. Today's engine drivers, like the tourists, gaze in awe at the wrecked concrete hulks, symbolic of the final demise of Nazi oppression and the creation of modern Poland.